So this is the point in the course in which we're going to transition away from specifically talking about information that is common amongst both principles courses that you may take, like principles of macro or principles of micro. Some institutions, they have a prereq where you learn this stuff before you take the second version, but most institutions require basically learning about the kind of fundamentals of economics, like supply and demand, production possibilities, frontier, and trade, prior to kind of the rest of the course. So this is the point in which we kind of fork off and move into specifically discussing macroeconomic concepts. So this lecture will kind of give us a little bit of an intro to macroeconomics, and then we will pivot to talking specifically about how we measure macroeconomic performance, particularly economic activity within a country through gross domestic product. So what is macroeconomics? The difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics is that macroeconomics is going to be the study of the economy as a whole. So if you have taken microeconomics or you plan to take microeconomics in the future, microeconomics would kind of build off of the supply and demand model and look at it with kind of a fine-tooth comb under a microscope, so to speak, that basically we're going to analyze demand in isolation and figure out what determines demand based on utility and consumer choice. We're going to derive basically market supply from individual firms trying to optimize and maximize their overall profits based on the costs that they're incurring, based on the productivity that they can achieve with the resources that they have, and what the demand for their product is at a given point based on different competition. So it's looking at things at the biggest level is the supply and demand graph we just completed. But at the smallest level, the most granular level, is very kind of philosophical and specific as it pertains to particular individual decision-making units like businesses or people. Macroeconomics is going to actually have the smallest level of the economy be the market that we just analyzed. But we're going to now take a bird's eye view and kind of zoom out and see kind of what is these markets interacting with each other helping create in terms of an economy. Is it a healthy economy? Is it a struggling economy? Are people doing well? Are we doing well relative to the past? Is our standard of living improving? Is our economic performance good relative to where we expect to be based on the resources that we have? Kind of what is changing in our economy that is causing people to do well versus not do well, are able for them to earn a living versus not be able to earn a living, allow for a standard of living to improve versus not. And how does that vary from country to country, region to region? And so all of that is basically the scope of our course here in macroeconomics. We want to look at the big picture. We want to see, okay, how does everyone working together in the way that they are result in some sort of economic growth or some sort of economic productivity? And the way we'll finish the course is saying, based on where we are, what are some economic policies that the government might want to undertake? The Federal Reserve or central bank, based on what country you're in, the central bank of the nation might want to undertake. What can we take as individuals to try and incentivize better public policy goals that help facilitate macroeconomic prosperity across the board, instead of just kind of helping certain groups of the population while the consistently struggling groups of the population continue to struggle? So those are the things that we'll kind of continue to talk about through the entire rest of the course. Right now, what we're going to focus on is specifically how do we measure macroeconomic performance with this unit here, where we're going to talk about GDP, particularly in this lecture, but then we'll talk about unemployment and inflation. And that kind of is our barometer of economic prosperity and health at the macro level in the short run. But then we'll talk about that there's a different time period known as the long run, where there's a kind of different goal that we're trying to achieve versus just kind of general stability with prices, employment, and consistent economic growth that we see in the short term. So how do we determine how well a country is performing? So again, the way we're going to measure the health of the economy is through some sort of metric that identifies the level of productivity and wealth that is going on within the country's borders. So the main way we're going to measure economic activity is through a measurement known as gross domestic product, or GDP. Other barometers that we will discuss are employment. So we call the unit unemployment, but it really is about employment. But the reason why we call it unemployment is because we spend a lot of time trying to analyze how many people are out of work and how do we group those people to kind of get a good estimate of the state of employment within the economy. And then the second one is going to be fluctuation of prices. So inflation might be a term that you're familiar with. That's basically what we're going to be discussing. How do prices change over time and what's causing them to change over time? And how does that result in some sort of consequence in terms of economic prosperity? Is prices going up good? Is it bad? Is it neutral? Should it be good or bad? And so those are the kind of three major prongs in which we will assess economic performance within this course. But the main one that actually measures how much stuff we're making, how much value is circulating through the economy, that's going to be something that's known as gross domestic product. So what are the goals of a strong economy? So we have two time periods in which we'll be analyzing things. In the short term, what we're going to try and achieve is growth in our production, stable employment, and stable changes in prices. So we don't necessarily need prices to remain constant or remain the same. There actually could be some negative consequences of prices remaining stagnant because there's a lot of correlation between these variables. So like employment and inflation and employment are supposed to have some sort of inverse relationship known as the Phillips curve relationship. Empirical data doesn't necessarily support that theory, but intuitively it makes sense. And regardless, there's still some semblance of correlation between all these variables. So it could be that if prices are constant, it could be a sign of something else like high unemployment or low economic growth. So we don't necessarily want prices to remain constant. We want them to increase at kind of a stable, consistent rate. We want our economy to continuously grow, because if we're continuously growing as an economy, especially if our population is going up, that's kind of indicative that we are becoming progressively more efficient or progressively more productive as time goes on. And we come up with more innovative ways to do things, or we have more people that are demanding goods and services, so we're providing the supply for those goods and services that are demanded. This differs a little bit from the long term, also known as the long run, where our goal is to continuously improve the standard of living of a country's citizens. So I know I'm bouncing around here with the slides. I apologize for that, just pushing the wrong button. But basically, what do we mean by standard of living? When we get to the long run growth economic lecture, standard of living is going to be measured in some semblance of GDP as a proportion of the population or relative to the population. And so what we're looking for in the short term is just kind of stability and growth. What we're looking for in the long term is we're looking for improvements to our lives. So in the short run, we're just trying to make sure we've got everything taken care of. The bills are paid, the house isn't on fire, everyone's fed, and everyone's employed, and the economy's not crashing. In the long term, just kind of making sure that we're maintaining the status quo is not necessarily a good thing. We kind of want to continuously push forward to improve the lives that we have. So If you just kind of think about 100 years ago versus 50 years ago versus 30 years ago versus now, to see all of the innovations that have been achieved over that period of time that have helped in medical, helped in education, helped in technology, that have allowed for us to be able to have easier lives. Now, that's not to say life is easy. Life is always hard for everybody. But the reality is that the options, the conveniences, the opportunities that exist now um, are on the backs of what people have done over time to push the needle forward, so that way our lives are easier. So maybe we've gotten to the point in some regards where we take things for granted too much. And so when things don't go according to plan, maybe we freak out a little bit too much because of the fact that we're not used to kind of solving the problems the way they used to have to be solved, because we've got things that solve those problems for us. But the nice thing about economics is that we spend our days and nights thinking about things from the perspective of critical thinking and the unintended consequences. So that way, if something is going not according to plan, we can kind of figure out why that's happening and try to make suggestions for how that can be improved. So why do we have goals that vary? I think this is a good time to kind of think about it introspectively and be like, well, why am I here right now? Why am I listening to this lecture? Why am I watching this lecture? Why am I taking this class? Why am I doing this homework assignment? Well, there's a couple of ways in which you can look at it. You can look at it from the short-term picture where you signed up for this class. You want to make sure that you're understanding the material in the course. You want to make sure that the bills are paid and that you don't fail this course. So you have created a routine, or you've built into your schedule a certain set of processes to get things done. How you're going to eat today, who's taking care of the kids, or who's taking care of family members, pets, significant others, given their current situation, who's going to take care of you in terms of are you going to go to work if you have to go to work? Have you gone to work? Have you paid that bill? Have you done the homework for this class? A lot of those things are just kind of day to day, check the box, get through the day, make sure that you're not doing something that's significantly damaging to the overall kind of system that you're living in. You don't want to burn your house down. You don't want to starve your child. You don't want to fail the course. So you're doing all these kind of maintenance tasks to get through the day and to get through the week. So make sure everything's kind of maintained in terms of order. That's your short-term goals. That's what economic policy is going to be talking about a lot. If we see that the house is on fire, if we see that there are some significant problems that where if we don't take care of them and maintain them properly, it's going to have a significant negative impact on our not only our short-term but our long-term outcomes, then we want to step in and try and do something to help aid that. But part of the so like when you're thinking about taking this class in the moment, you might just be thinking like, I got to get this homework done, I got to listen, I got to make sure I understand this because I don't want to fail. But the reality is that for a lot of you, maybe you're not in this class because you're going to major in economics and this is your kind of stepping stone to a career in economics. I mean, I wish and I hope that that's the case. So if you are in that boat, then let's chit chat and let's get you on that path. And let me give you some guidance to head you in that direction that you need to go. But for those of you who are here for general education, those of you who are here for a requirement for a business program or something of that nature, this might be a means to an end. And that end is hopefully some long-term goal of achieving some sort of degree in some sort of field, whether it's business, whether it's economics, whether it's some other degree, and you're just taking this for the general education requirements. your goal is to kind of get to a point that you want to get to in terms of your long-term outlook on life. Maybe you're trying to pivot careers. Maybe you're trying to start a career. Maybe you're just trying to kind of push the envelope further in terms of educational attainment in your family, and you want to see where it heads, and you have no idea where it's going to head, but you're just kind of playing the game and following the trail and hoping it takes you to somewhere beautiful and fruitful and prosperous. Whatever the case, there's some sort of long-term outlook that you're hoping to achieve out of that, whether it's a new career, a better career, more money, financial stability, financial literacy, whatever it may be. There's some sort of long-term outlook that is causing you to be here right now. And so a lot of times we get so bogged down in the day to day, we don't realize that we're building towards the future. So like when you kind of set aside $5 to $10 into a savings account and you set it aside and then you just kind of ignore it for months and weeks and years, or if you're just kind of going through an educational program and you're taking this class and another class, and then the next semester you take other classes, and you just keep going and going, and then boom, you finished all your requirements. You look kind of behind you and you're like, wow, I've came a long way. I've learned a lot of things. I've achieved a lot of things. And now I have this piece of paper that vouches for the fact that I've done it. And hopefully I can put that on a resume or a CV and then pivot my way into a career that's more prosperous. And that prosperous might be in terms of finally maybe you get to move to a place you wanted to go, or travel to a place you wanted to go, or maybe you're able to move out of a neighborhood that you didn't want to live in because you just didn't have enough money to, and now you do. Or maybe you're moving into a career that you were okay at and making decent money at, but it really wasn't what you wanted to do. And now you have the freedom to be able, and the expertise to be able to do the career and pursuits that you want to. Maybe you want to have a better opportunity to provide for your family. Whatever that long-term goal is, you're building towards it in the short run, but you have to always, by doing day-to-day tasks, but you also have to put yourself in a position where those day-to-day tasks helps get you there. So like if you're doing your day-to-day tasks and you don't go to school, or you don't search for new jobs, or you don't kind of look up and research what your different careers could be, you could be okay, stable in your short term, but you might not be building towards a long-term goal that may get you to where you really aspire to get to. So naturally, the economy, again, is the byproduct of individuals making decisions. So us in the short term versus the long term is kind of the same way that we would look at and solve the problem. And that's how the economy looks at it. If we're all short-sighted and like instant gratification, and then kick the can down the road for debt, and we all end up kind of becoming insolvent and defaulting on our debt because we're irresponsible with money, well, then the economy is going to reflect that, because if you're doing it, then I'm sure there's plenty of other people doing it too. So you shouldn't blame yourself if you end up in that position, but you also have to realize, okay, well, if we want the rest of the economy to do this, it's dependent upon everybody. So we all need to kind of pull our weight and try to make the right decisions. Now, there's always going to be those bad actors that kind of ruin it for all of us, but optimizing for the world that you want to live in is the best way to try and push the world to the direction that you want it to go. So is the economy always good or bad? As the slide says, chances are it depends on who you ask. When I was living in Toledo, Ohio, a few years ago, there was this gentleman who was selling used cars, and he had a commercial on at like 2:00 in the morning. And he would, it was the same commercial, and he would just be like, folks, we're just coming out of recession. Now, mind you, this was circa 2016, 2017, maybe even earlier than that, maybe 2015. The Great Recession was between 2007 and 2009. So when this commercial was recorded, I don't know, but it was being aired 7 to 8 years after the recession had ended. And so it signified to me one of two things. One, they filmed it 8 years prior and they just didn't get around to or have the means to afford to make a new commercial. The second one was the person that was trying to sell the car was trying to prey on the fact that lots of people don't have a good grasp on what's known as the business cycle. The business cycle is this alternating period of economic growth and economic decline. So prosperity and decline. So when we have an economic growth phase, it's known as an expansion phase. And that expansion phase continues until we hit what's known as a business cycle peak. Then after that, the economy starts to slow down. It produces less than it did in the previous quarter, month, year. And we end up having a period that's known as a recession. Now, a recession is distinct. It has to be at least 2 quarters or 6 months of continuous economic decline. And it ends with a business cycle trough. So in 2020, we had a recession that was based on COVID-19. Now, it's debatable. We might have still had a recession in 2020 had it not been for COVID, because there was actually a lot of indicators suggesting that the economy was kind of slowing down and stagnating. And then when we did the shutdown in March, it really kind of triggered a recession and there was no getting around it. So recession was probably going to happen in 2020, but it clearly wouldn't have been as dramatic and quick as it would have been had there not been coronavirus kind of ravaging and infiltrating the world. So there was so if that commercial was on now, it would be a little bit relevant again. And who's to say if we're not going to end up in another recession? So again, you have to have 2 consecutive quarters. So January through June, we had a recession in 2020. It shot back up once we reopened things, and then it's kind of slowed down again into 2021. So moving forward, it remains to be seen whether we're going to continuously move into a expansion phase, if just the slowdown is just kind of navigating through the remaining kind of obstacles of COVID in terms of the fallout of delaying rent delinquencies or mortgage defaults or high unemployment and things like that. So there may be a recession again in the near future, or we may be out of it and be moving slowly into an economic expansion phase. We'll talk about recessions in the historical context of recessions as we move through this material. So if a lot of this terminology seems confusing to you, or you're like, I don't know what a recession is, I don't know what GDP is, I don't know what quarters are. Quarters are just quarters of the year, 3-month window. But basically, we're always going through these business cycles. They never really, so like we're never going to not have recessions again, and we're never going to not have economic expansion again. So naturally, we're going to have these kind of waxes and wanes of the economic system. But again, the whole goal is to hope that the expansion is so long that it offsets any losses in a recession, and hopefully our long run economic growth focus helps us facilitate that. So the recession in 2020 was 11 years after the end of the previous recession in April of 2009. That's when the last one ended, or the Great Recession ended. And that was the longest period of time between recessions in kind of American history since World War II. So like I said, it was pretty much inevitable that we would have probably hit a wall where we would have had a recession, whether it would have been 2020 or 2021, or if it would have just kind of been like a weak one where there was just not too much dip, but just kind of slowing down. We had to kind of focus more into long-term outcomes instead of short-term outcomes to kind of get the economy jump started again. but because of COVID, it was substantially different than what we normally would have expected. But as I mentioned before, even though we have business cycles and stock markets and moon cycles, so like full moons and new moons and waxing gibbouses and waning gibbouses, the moon cycle every 28 days, stock markets, you have bull markets and bear markets, and bunch of other things that you may have that are cyclical. The economy has its natural ups and downs. Now, the whole hope is that even if we have an inevitable recession, that it's something that's beyond our control and not something that we could have done to prevent it. So, like, there's some arguments as to why the economy was slowing down in 2020, and it could have been as a result of economic policy, which we'll talk about at the end of the course. Or it may have just been that there wasn't going to be one, and then COVID again, in terms of it causing issues across the world, that was something that was beyond our control. Now, you can have debates in terms of how the United States has handled the response to it, which may or may have exacerbated or mitigated or whatever. I think it's going to be a long post-mortem before we actually figure out what we did as individuals and as a nation, and whether we did mitigate it, we did exacerbate it, or we did it wouldn't have been better or worse no matter what we did, based on which side of the coin we were on in terms of policy reactions. But long story short, we had one, and even though we're not technically in a recession in early 2021, clearly the economy is going to have a lot of work to do to kind of get back to the way it was. So again, as I've mentioned before, the stock market is a subset of the macroeconomy. It is not the economy. So even though the Dow Jones may be doing well, or cryptocurrencies may be up, or certain stocks may be up, it doesn't necessarily mean that people have jobs and that things are economically prosperous for everybody. And even when we talk about these economic variables, it may not be that everybody's doing well in that context either. But to focus on this difference between short-term and long-term, one of the things that long-run economic growth helps with is to try and mitigate the severity of these recessions. So the Great Recession was the worst economic downturn that we had had since the Great Depression, which was in the 30s, the 1930s. And so the question then, though, is like, which circumstances would you rather live in? Would you rather live in the 1929 scenario? So you might be thinking, oh, well, I like nostalgia and I like the Roaring Twenties and the Flappers and the Gatsby world and like the good old days like that. But the question is like, would you rather be unemployed and struggling in 1929 or 2009? Because in 2009, yes, lots of people lost their houses, but think about all the other things that you wouldn't have had in 80 years prior. Would you have had, look at all the industries, look at all the medical care innovations. So like a lot of the medications that we take wouldn't have even been viable. So, or existed. So we might have still been dealing with polio or smallpox or other diseases that we've been able to treat. So like HIV and HPV and chickenpox. Like the vaccine for chickenpox didn't come around until 1994. Now we've got shingles vaccinations, and now we've got COVID vaccinations. So think about all these innovations that have kind of come to bear over the past 80 years that have allowed for us to be able to, from a kind of human capital standpoint, be able to overcome recessions in a little bit different ways. That doesn't make being unemployed hurt any less. It doesn't make losing your house hurt any less. So I'm not saying that by any means, but standard of living improvements over a long period of time help us kind of weather the storm a little bit better. So me personally, my family, so I was wrapping up high school during the Great Recession, and my parents lost their house and they lost their car during the Great Recession. So I graduated high school, and it was like, congratulations, like, you graduated high school, now pack up all your stuff and move it out of this house that you like grew up in, because when you come home from your first semester of college, uh, we won't be living there anymore. But when you come home from your first semester of college, you'll still be working at the pizza place that's across the street from your old house. So you'll get to drive past it 20 times a day when you're delivering pizzas to remind you that this used to be your home, but it no longer is anymore. It's the bank's house now. So the ghosts of the Great Recession are still something that play a significant role on the psyche of the Gen Yers, the millennials of the world, because of and Gen Xers too, of those who lost their homes. So the people growing up in it, the people that actually lost, it still weighs heavy on the mind, but at least and we have lots of issues in terms of healthcare costs and access that could be a class in and of itself, but at least there's potential where, like, if something happened disease wise or whatever during the time in which that happened, there was at least remedies to try and solve that problem, even if the cost was substantial. And also, like, new industries that allowed for you to pivot to new jobs, technology that allowed for you to be able to have new career paths or be able to find jobs easier. I mean, in 2020, with COVID and the recession, think about how education would have kind of looked completely different 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago. We didn't have the internet infrastructure, the smartphone infrastructure, the capacity and infrastructure with the internet to be able to have a remote course taught live back then that now we have. So disruptions to education would have been substantial back then. Maybe we would have just kind of did the in-class thing anyways and not dealt with any, and not tried to kind of create this more kind of socially distant atmosphere if we were back then. But regardless, as we move forward, the hope is that those long-term improvements help mitigate the severity of the short-term fluctuations that may feel like quite painful in the moment. So that's kind of a little bit of introduction as to kind of talking about what macroeconomics represents, what it's going to be focusing on, what it's going to look at, looking at economic prosperity both in the short term versus the long term, and kind of how we are able to get there or not get there. And then after that, we'll talk about how we can kind of visualize the aggregate economy from the perspective of the two models known as the aggregate expenditures model and the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. So the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model is going to look a lot like the regular supply and demand model, but it's going to be including everything in the economy, not just televisions or bananas or cookies or whatever the specific market that you were looking at represents. So with that being said, I want to turn our attention to kind of the main topic of this unit, which is GDP, or gross domestic product. So GDP is a measurement of national income or economic productivity. GDP, gross domestic product. So gross domestic product, what it means is gross as in total. So not gross as in like icky, but gross as in total. So don't think that, some people might think GDP is icky, that they're afraid to learn about it and that it's messy and complicated to understand. But when we say gross, we just mean total. Just like net is like plus, minus, minus, like positive minus negative. Gross, or like revenues minus costs. Gross is just the total before you factor in costs or negativity or outflows or things like that. There are four major kind of components to this definition that are critical. So as I mentioned before, when I assess you in a lot of things in this course, it's not just merely telling me what a definition is or like listing off a bunch of things like it's some sort of trivia contest where you can kind of name drop a bunch of stuff to like impress and kind of navigate your way through. You really need to understand this information. And so this is no different. Since there really are only 3 variables in which you need to know, I want you to know them inside and out so you know how to critique them, you know how to analyze them, you know how to quantify them, and so you can make kind of a judgment as to whether or not the way in which we assess economic growth and productivity is effective. Because I'm a big baseball fan. One of the things about baseball that has kind of gotten away from the sport is there's been this analytics revolution, which baseball is full of data. And so it seems like a positive thing to have all this extra information, all this analytics. It's permeating into every aspect of life, and it's permeating into every aspect of sports. But one of the takeaways that has happened is when the Hall of Fame voters are trying to vote, when players are trying to negotiate their salaries in arbitration and all these other kind of circumstances, this statistic known as wins above replacement or WAR keeps popping up. Like, oh, I'm worth 7 wins above my replacement based on this metric that we've created. GDP is kind of the war of economic measurement, where basically it's kind of this catch-all measurement that's hoping to simplify our estimation of the size of the economy and allow for us to benchmark ourselves with other countries and ourselves. And so one of the pitfalls of that, though, is you don't want to oversimplify and you don't want to make your analysis based on one thing. So when we talk about kind of whether the economy is good or not, even though we're learning 3 specific variables, I don't want you to fall into the trap of that's all that matters. And in fact, later on, we'll talk about what it doesn't include and things that maybe you want to include when you're trying to determine whether something is a good economy, a safe economy, or not. But with that being said, the definition of GDP is going to be very technical and specific. So I'm going to break it down into kind of 4 major parts, and hopefully knowing those 4 major parts within the definition will help you identify what does count and what does not count in GDP. And so when I give you a question that says, here's a scenario, how much does it contribute to GDP? You'll be able to figure out, okay, well, this doesn't count because of this, or this part of it counts, but this part doesn't count because of this and this and this. And so that's kind of going to be the puzzle that you'll have to solve to understand, to justify and demonstrate to me that you really do understand what's going on as it pertains to the measurement of GDP. So these 4 components are as follows. The first one is that it's the total value. So total value means kind of the accumulation of the value of the stuff that we're measuring. So what stuff are we measuring? Well, we're measuring the final goods and services produced in a country. So final goods and services. Well, what on earth does final mean? I'll get to that in a second, because it's easier to define what isn't a final good or a service versus what is. But hopefully after I explain it, it will make sense. But basically, we're taking the value of all of the goods and services that we determine to be a final good or service. So instead of just kind of giving you a long laundry list or Excel spreadsheet of all the stuff that was made in America this year, we can aggregate all the values of those things that we produced and sold and or didn't sell, doesn't have to be sold, produced in the country, and basically convert it to a specific variable in terms of dollars. So just like with wins above replacement in baseball, where it's just a number that basically kind of is summarizing a bunch of different stats that are kind of shoehorned into this one statistic, GDP is kind of similar in that regard, where basically you have all of the stuff that's made, you value all the stuff that's made, and then you combine it all, add it all together, and you have a number. That's why gross is total, because you're adding all those things together. Produced in a country. So later on, we'll talk about something known as gross national product, or GNP, and talk about the difference between GNP, which used to be a way we measured things, and you can still measure things that way, versus GDP, and why we prefer to use GDP versus GNP. And the big difference here is that it's because it's produced in the country's borders. So GDP is hopefully a better estimate of kind of the actual activity of a country, because it's measuring the value of the stuff that's being made in the country versus crediting whoever is American, or whoever is Chinese for China, or whoever is German for Germany. You want to make sure that what we're measuring is indicative of stuff that's going to be circulating economic productivity in the economy. So if you go back to the circular flow model, like just because someone is an American, or just because a company is an American, but they have a giant plant in Tennessee, or just because they aren't an American citizen, but they are permanent resident, or they have a green card, or they're a student here, and they've worked here for 10 years and they're paying taxes. Like, there's some sort of economic activity that should be measured for that, versus just kind of crediting it to people that just so happen to be citizens. And so you get some incongruencies with GNP that you otherwise don't get with GDP. And then the last thing is over a period of time. So GDP is traditionally reported quarterly, which means every 3 months. But for simplicity's sake, for our course, we're mainly going to focus on GDP as it's measured annually, so year by year. But the period of time is really dependent upon how you want to measure it. But typically, we're going to stick to within a given year instead of a given 3-month window. So again, this definition is critical. So like, again, you need to know the definition, all the words in it, but it's not about regurgitating the words to me. It's about really thinking about what each piece and part of it is telling you. So total value is pretty straightforward. It's just taking all the stuff that's made and converting it to a dollar value, and then aggregating at that dollar value, so you get the gross total instead of just a big list of things that aren't the same. So, we made a bunch of computers and TVs and car washes and cookies, but how do we combine them? Well, we combine them based on the market value of those products. So what is a final good or service? A final good and service is a good and service purchased by a final user. So what does that mean? Does that definition really help? Probably not, but basically what a final user is a person that's not going to repurpose it and sell it as something else. So basically you can buy bread, peanut butter, and jelly. You can repurpose all of that stuff into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And if you consume that, well, then you're the final user of all those things. So the bread, the peanut butter, and the jelly are all final goods. But let's say you work for Smucker's and you make Uncrustables, where you put some peanut butter jelly in some like bread shell and freeze it and then ship it off to a store to sell. Well, then the Uncrustable is the final good and not the actual components used to produce the Uncrustable. So final goods and services are goods and services that are purchased by the person who's going to be the final consumer of it. They're either going to eat it, use it till it breaks down, or they're going to repurpose the stuff into something that they're going to use for their own personal benefit. So when I was building the closets in my house, I bought the wood shelf, the wood pieces of wood that would basically become the shelf. And then I bought rods, and then I bought little hooks that the wood shelves would sit on and the rod would kind of fit into. So like, I bought all that stuff independently, and it wasn't like a predetermined box of stuff that I like bought and then just assembled. It was stuff that I had bought for myself, and I assembled my own closet organizers and built them and installed them, and I'm the person that's using them. I'm not gonna, I mean, maybe someday when I sell the house, then the value added from that will count in some regard. And we'll talk about those examples in a little bit. But because I bought the wood individually and the rods individually and the hooks individually, we're not going to say that those are what are known as intermediate goods and services, where they're being repurposed into something else that's eventually going to be sold. So you can assess the value of the final product that they create versus the product that it is. So final goods and services count toward GDP. Intermediate goods and services do not count towards GDP. So again, an intermediate good or service, let's say that you're General Motors and you're building a new car. If you're building a new car, the tires, the steering wheel, the battery, the frame, the drivetrain, the windows and the glass, all of that is individually something. So the tires are something, the steering wheel is something, the glass for the windshield and the windows is something, the drivetrain is something, the exhaust pipe is something, the battery is something. All of those things are products, they're goods in and of themselves, but because they're being used to make something else, a car that's eventually going to be sold, the value of all those things independently are not going to be factored into GDP, because we're going to factor the value of those things in the final value of the car. So you don't want to double count something. You don't want the tire that's a stock tire for a brand new car to count twice, because the value of that stock tire is going to be rolled into the cost of the car when they sell it. So like if you've ever heard of the term the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that's basically what we're talking about when we talk about intermediate goods and services versus final goods and services, that the value of the final good is going to be at minimum worth as much as the sum of the parts, and most likely worth more than the sum of the parts. And so we don't have to worry about double counting or not counting something because of the fact that the value of those things that were used to build the final thing are already factored into the price and the market value of the final thing. Another thing that you might find interesting is that me as an individual teaching you is an intermediate service. I am not a final service, because when you register for the course and you're assessed a tuition bill, it's typically for the credit hours in which you registered. So even though I may be your main point of contact for this course, I am not the end all be all. I may create the assignments, I may grade the assignments, I may provide the lecture, I may provide the source material, I may do a lot of things, pretty much almost everything for the course. But I am not the course. And to you, I may be the course, but the course itself is just 3 credit hours of tuition for a specific class. And basically the goal is at the end of all of this, you've got a passing grade in the course that counts as X number of credit hours towards your degree program or towards a program requirement. And so that's what you paid for. You didn't pay for me. As much as I would be flattered if you did, you didn't pay for me. You paid for your own tuition, for your own credit hours. And so if it were that I was a final service, it would be the fact that I would be getting paid 100% of your tuition, and I would figure out how to provide you with all this other stuff, and it would be my responsibility to figure out how to deal with the costs associated with administering this course to you, not the institutions. So when we talk about an intermediate good or service, or this course, like I'm an intermediate service because I'm only getting paid a fraction of what the total amount of tuition that you're paying to the institution is. I've always said that the future of education and teaching is probably this more independent contractor, freelance type of world where basically you can kind of forum shop to find the most affordable option, the most convenient option, or the most effective option for each individual course. And then basically the aggregation of all those courses builds up to a degree in some sort of program that's kind of centralized somewhere, whether it's through an accreditation agency and not just the institution itself. Because right now it's centralized with the institution. But as we move on and things become more progressively online, you might end up seeing more centralized institutions like accreditation agencies. And then you can kind of just choose where you want to take the class and then just transfer it into some kind of centralized location instead of having to deal with this, oh, I don't know if econ principles of macro or principles of micro is going to transfer to this state university or this private institution and have to deal with like the monopolization of transfer credits and stuff like that. So that becomes the case, then maybe I will be a final service or a final good. But even then, I'd probably still be the intermediate, because even though I'm the person creating and administering the course, like, you're not paying for my services, you're paying for the class itself. So, and even then, if I'm getting more of a cut of it, great, but I'd still probably still be considered an intermediate service. So again, final goods and services will be consumed by the purchaser of the product. So you can produce something else out of it, like a peanut butter sandwich from bread, peanut butter, and jelly. But if you don't sell that peanut butter sandwich to somebody else, then there is no real extra value that's created from you assembling that. So you personally might derive benefit and utility from that combination, but there is no market value created from that combination because you didn't sell it. So there's no way of assessing the value of it. Therefore, all those individual components will be considered a final good or a final service instead of an intermediate one. So again, final goods and services will count. Intermediate goods and services won't count. Most things are final, so there really doesn't have to be this like dilemma as to whether it's intermediate or not. But I'm sure that I will put some questions on the homework or the exam that will assess such as intermediate versus final, so that way you understand the difference.
So does it have to be sold as opposed to being like given away? So like if you make a sandwich again and you give it away but you don't sell it, would you still be considered the final consumer?
That's a good question. The answer for your question is yes. Basically, if you do anything for yourself or someone else that doesn't have any sort of market value attached to it, then it won't count towards GDP beyond what you can already measure. So this is going to come up later on when we talk about something known as household production, or basically anything that you do for yourself. So if you babysit, or you take care of your kids, or you make your family dinner, or you give a friend a ride to work, or anything like that. Like if you took an Uber to work, like it would count towards GDP because you actually know what the market value of it is. But because you gave a friend a ride as a favor, there's no market value attached to it. So there's no way of kind of paper trailing it to being counted towards GDP. So it would have a value of 0. But like, let's say you do buy all the stuff to make dinner for your friends and they don't pay you for it. Well, then the final value is just all the ingredients that you bought. So you might have made something that gave everyone benefit and utility that is beyond just eating them by themselves. So like if you make spaghetti, you're like cooking the noodles and boiling the noodles and adding in the sauce and adding in the meat if you want like a meat sauce, and cooking up the meat and mixing it with the sauce. That combined, and sprinkling the Parmesan cheese on top, or whatever type of cheese you would want on top, if any. Combining all that together is going to derive more value and benefit in terms of how you intrinsically feel about it than if you were just taking a spoon out and eating the sauce out of the jar and then eating the spaghetti without cooking it. Like, clearly there's a different level of satisfaction there, but there's no actual market value created from it. So we don't count it in as anything added beyond whatever you paid to buy the stuff individually. So intermediate goods will be factored into GDP in the value of the final good. And another thing that you brought up that I want to mention is that something doesn't have to be sold. There's going to be a distinct difference between stuff that's sold, because when we sell something, we distinctly know what the value is. If we don't sell something, it ends up counting as something that's known as inventories. So inventories are things that are produced in a given year or quarter, but they aren't sold yet. So like General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Tesla, they all have vehicles that are produced months in advance, and then they have a model year attached to them. So like, let's say that you want to make a 2022 model year vehicle, but it's produced in September of 2021. Well, the model year doesn't matter. It's about the year in which it's made. So like, if you build a vehicle in 2021, but it doesn't sell till January or February of 22, what's going to end up happening is that the value that's attached to the vehicle, if it was sold in 21, would be the final sale of the car. But if we don't sell it in 21, rather than have to follow and track down that car until it gets sold in 2022 or 2023 or 2035, we just basically count it as an inventory based on how much it costs us to make it. So if you've ever watched a television show where there was a business trying to go through and count the value of their inventory, a lot of businesses make the mistake of valuing their inventory at how much they think that they could sell it at if they sold it at their suggested retail price. So like, let's say it costs you $10 to make something and you normally sell it for 30. What a lot of people make the mistake of is they base the inventory based on the $30 sales tag and not the $10 cost. Because even if you sell it for a loss, it still created $10 worth of economic activity because of the fact that you had to pay $10 in stuff to make it happen. So again, GDP is measuring productivity and economic activity, not sales. So like, a lot of it will be measured in sales, because when you sell something, you know exactly how much it's worth. But if you don't sell something, our temporary way of valuing it is just how much it costs us to make it. So that's why I said, in some regards, the whole is equal at minimum, greater than or equal to the sum of its parts. So intermediate goods do not count, final goods do. So we'll go through some examples throughout that hopefully will help identify this difference. The next important thing that pertains to GDP and how we measure it is where it's made, not who owns it. So this is kind of the big difference between gross national product and gross domestic product, is that GDP measures production in a country's borders over a given period of time. So in the borders. So this is one thing that I think, as time goes on, people have a better grasp and understanding of this. But if you were kind of taking this class, I don't know, even 10 years ago, but more like 20 to 30 years ago, there would be a big kind of point of contention here. Just like when we talked about absolute advantage versus comparative advantage, where, okay, absolute advantage seems like it would be the reason why we would trade, because, oh, well, why would I trade with someone that can't make as much as I can? Well, the reality is that there's a trade-off that happens where you're going to have to trade something off to make that other thing that you otherwise could have had someone else make, and then you could have specialized in the thing that makes you the most money. Same holds true for GDP. We do not credit basically who owns the company. We credit where the stuff was made. So you can have a Ford vehicle, American company, based in Dearborn, Michigan. And Ford can produce that car in Mexico. Because the factors of the production, the investment, the labor, all of that has been compensated within the borders of Mexico, that will actually count towards Mexico's GDP, even though it's an American company. So if the parts come from Mexico and the labor comes from Mexico and the people that are working in the plant in Mexico are getting paid in pesos, and they take those pesos and go to the local grocery store or buy a house in Mexico, all of that money is staying within the Mexico's borders and is indicative of economic activity within Mexico. So it doesn't matter that Ford is the company that's providing it. So this is kind of something that's known as foreign direct investment, where a foreign company or a foreign business invests in a plant in a different country. GNP will credit that towards the country who owns the business, but GDP credits it to the country that made the thing. So you could have Toyota. So Toyota, a Japanese company, they have a lot of plants. Hyundai is similar, where you have a foreign car company that has many plants and many infrastructure within the borders of the United States. So just because it's a Toyota and it's got the bull logo, or just because it's a Hyundai and it has a H with an oval circle around it as its logo, doesn't automatically mean that it's from Asia, that it was an import from Asia. Now, you can have a Toyota or a Hyundai that came from Japan or Korea, but oftentimes nowadays it's much cheaper for them to build the vehicle where it's going to be sold, so they don't have to deal with the tariffs, and they don't have to deal with the long shipment cost of building the car in Asia and then shipping it across the Pacific Ocean to North America. And so what does that do? That creates jobs for Americans. Plenty of people that work for Hyundai or Toyota in the United States, and they build cars that are going to be built by Americans for Americans. They're going to be sold here in America. And so that, just because it's a foreign company, and yes, you can talk about how profit margins and things might end up getting sent back overseas, but in terms of labor and jobs, I feel like the person that's working for that plant would much rather have the job than to kind of be upset over the fact that the name of the company doesn't sound American enough. So the reality is that when we credit things for GDP, it's not about who makes it or who owns the company that's making it. It's about where it is made. And so we will always credit the country in which it's made, not the company who makes it. So GNP would actually credit the company that makes it, not the country that it's made in. And that's where the big discrepancy comes in between GNP and GDP. So, and this happens a lot with a lot of companies these days. There's plenty of American companies that import everything that they make and sell to you. And there's plenty of foreign companies that make everything here in America and sell it to you in America. And they provide jobs for Americans. So this isn't a discussion about what's good or bad in terms of globalization and things like that. I think it's more so just to kind of clarify that when we measure economic activity, I think it does a better job of estimating, because it's saying, okay, this is the money that's actually, and the wealth and the prosperity and the activity that's actually circulating within the borders of the country, and not just, oh, well, Nike produces everything in Bangladesh and China and other countries, but they sell a ton of it in America. And so therefore, like, all of the production and economic activity that's happening in Vietnam and Bangladesh and Pakistan are all being credited towards America's GDP. We probably wouldn't want that either, because that's not actually American jobs. Now, the people that work in the Nike headquarters in Beaverton, Oregon, yeah, they work, and maybe people that are being hired to kind of be marketers for their product, yeah, that's American jobs and American creation wealth. So we're going to count that, but we're not going to count the stuff that's made overseas, because that doesn't really make any sense in terms of estimating whether it's going to be creating jobs or creating wealth for Americans at the kind of more, at the most granular level in terms of employment. And then the last thing has to do with the time of production. So the time of when it's made matters, not when it's sold. So again, just like I told you before, it doesn't matter if you sell something or not, because GDP measures productivity, not sales. It measures production, not sales. So, yes, most of the way in which we measure GDP is through sales, because when you actually sell something, you know how much it's worth. But if you don't sell something, it's not like that thing was never created. So, like, let's say that you have a family member that works in a stamping plant in Detroit, and that Ford vehicle that they helped build, or that Lordstown Motors new electric truck that they're trying to produce, they helped build that. Just because that truck doesn't sell, or that sedan doesn't sell, or that SUV doesn't sell that they built this year until the following year, doesn't mean that that person didn't build it and didn't get paid to build it. So we don't just ignore things that aren't sold. We still value those things, but we value them again as inventories, not as the distinct value of how much it actually ends up selling for. So you might build something for $12,000 this year, sell it for $30,000 next year, but the contribution to this year's GDP will be $12,000, not $30,000, because it wasn't sold within the year. So we don't know what the distinct market value of it is in this year, because it wasn't sold in this year. And we're not going to spend time, money, and resources trying to track down how much every single thing sells for. But if it's already in the data that, oh, this car sold this year for $30,000, well, then we don't have to worry about the value of the intermediate goods anymore, because those are rolled into the final value of the car that was much, much higher than the cost of producing it. So again, the given period of time is usually 1 year. It can also be measured monthly or quarterly. So we could be like, oh, well, this was built in Q1, but it didn't sell till Q2. So you could do the same thing where this is the change in inventories between Q1 and Q2 of this year's gross domestic product. But for the sake of simplicity in this class, we're just going to focus on GDP at an annual level. And again, the sale of the product is inconsequential, meaning it doesn't matter. But if a product is made in 2020 but not sold until 2021, it will count towards 2020's GDP. It won't count towards 2021's GDP. And also the value of it will be equivalent to the sum of the intermediate goods, not the value added, because there is no value added in the year in which it was produced. So value added is if you kind of you put a bunch, so like let's say you have that peanut butter, that jelly and bread, and you make it into a sandwich, and then you go, I don't know, to a little league game and you sell peanut butter sandwiches for $1. Like, there you go. Like, you know what the value added of it is. It's $1 minus however much it costs you to buy the peanut butter, jelly, and bread, divided by the number of units you produced with it. So there you know that the value of it's $1, and the sum of the sandwiches you sell is going to be greater than the cost of the ingredients. And at that point, then you know what the value is. But if you don't, then it's just the value of the cost of the ingredients. Well, your question says, wouldn't the sale of the product have more effect on the economy than the production? Well, here's the thing. Naturally, it will indicate what the value of the production is, but the sale, this will be a little bit clearer when we talk about like real estate, where basically like something can appreciate in value just because of demand and supply forces. And so like the fact of the matter is that like when you have something that was built like 50 years ago, and just because of inflation and like that market being hot, that the value of the house is twice as much as it was 50 years ago, that has nothing to do with contributions to our economic activity. So the sale of the house has nothing to do with actual GDP unless we actually built a house or improved upon or made additions to the existing house. So the way you can look at it is that if you build a house or you build a car in 2021 or 2020, we'll say 2021, let's say you build a house or a car, build a car in 2021, but it doesn't sell till 2022. If you build the car in 2021, and it doesn't sell till 22, well, the reality is that if we're trying to measure the value of the car's contribution to 2021's economy, well, the sale price in 2022 has nothing to do with 2021. So we don't want to count market value, whether it's appreciation or depreciation of the value of that vehicle, because it has nothing to do with the year that we're concerned with. Does that make sense? So if you're trying to figure out, like, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with an example off the top of my head, but basically, when you get into an argument with someone and they bring up something from 5 years ago and it has nothing to do with the actual discussion or arguments you're having in the moment, you always, your instant reaction is to say, well, what does this have to do with now? It has nothing to do with now. It has everything to do with 5 years ago. Same thing with the sale of something that was produced in a previous period of time. That if it was made last year, it has nothing to do with this year. It has everything to do with last year's contributions to the economy. Because if you sell the car in 2022, it has nothing to do with 2022's economy because it didn't produce anything. Remember, we're measuring gross domestic production, product, not sales. Any other questions related to that? Okay. So here's an example that might help with kind of explaining that. If we build a house in 1975 and it sells for $100,000 and then it's sold in $200,000 in 2017, if only that's how much the real estate costs these days. Well, some places it is, but most places that people want to live in, it's way more than that. But anyways, if a house is built in 1975 and sold for $100,000, then it is sold in 2000 or for $200,000 in 2017. How much will the house count towards 1975's GDP? Well, the house will count $100,000 towards 1975's GDP because it was built in 1975, and we know the distinct value of the house in 1975 because of the fact that it was sold for that much. So the contribution to 1975's GDP will be $100,000. What is the contribution of the house towards 2017's GDP? The answer is 0. So again, let's say that you have you're sitting on an asset. Let's say that you've got a pair of shoes that like are rare, or you've got a piece of artwork that's rare. Like you've been sitting on it for 20, 50 years and the value of it is appreciated, but that has 0 bearing on our actual economic activity and productivity in our country in the given year. So even though you bought it for $10 and you sell it for $1 million, it has nothing to do with economic activity. It's just a transaction of money and wealth, but not actually production in the economy, because we're trying to measure the activity and production in the economy, not just kind of the wealth of movement of things that have already existed. We're trying to focus on what we've distinctly created in terms of wealth in the year or the quarter at hand, not what's happened in the past. Now, if the value of the home went up because we renovated the house, that's different. So like if this house goes up by $100,000 just because of where it is and inflation, no contribution to GDP. But if you have a situation in which you are you renovated the house, you put $30,000 worth of renovations into the house, and it sells for the $200,000, then at that point, the value to the year of GDP in which you sold it would actually be the $100,000 in improved value that was created from the $30,000 worth of renovations. So that's the difference. there is if you don't make any sort of productivity or improvements or work on it, and it just merely increases in value because of time or inflationary reasons, it has no impact on GDP. So for this answer, it's 0 for 2017 as 1975 would be 100,000. And then again, if you change the facts where basically it's like you reno in 17 for 30K and then it sells for 200,000 in that same year, then you would take the increase in value, which would be 100K, and that would be the answer for 2017 if you change the facts to be that scenario. You don't include the 30,000 in renovations because the value added of $100,000 captures the $30,000 in renovations. Now, if you would have renovated it for $30,000 and then you didn't sell it, well, then the contribution to GDP that year would be $30,000. If you reno and don't sell. So again, that's why it's so important to know all the elements of GDP and know why they count and what does and what doesn't count. Because if you change the facts of this, you can get 3 different answers. The simplest one was we're only measuring the value of GDP in the year in which it's produced. So 2017, if the value of the house goes to $10 million, who cares? Nothing changed to the house that caused it to change in value based on the year in which we're measuring in terms of productivity. But if you renovate the house and spend 30K and you just do it for your own personal benefit. So last year I renovated my house. I spent, I'm going to say I spent about $15,000, maybe a little less than that. New carpet, new paint, new closet organizers, new light fixtures, new fans, new appliances, and then probably a couple other things that I can't remember off the top of my head that I surely paid for. I didn't sell the house, though. I just am living in it, and it's now more to the specifications that I desire. And as a result, all that stuff is a contribution to last year's GDP of $15,000. Now, if I would have sold the house for $50K more than I paid for it, then the contribution of those $15,000 in improvements will be factored into the $50,000 higher sales price. And so the increase in contribution from that would have been the $50,000. So 3 different scenarios, 3 different answers. No improvements, no contribution to GDP. Improvements, but no sale, then it's the value of the improvements, the cost of the improvements. So again, an inventory type of analysis. And then if you sell it for a value higher than the actual improvements, then the improvements become intermediate goods and services, and then the final value added becomes the actual contribution to GDP. So it's very important that you know those differences. We can break GDP down into 4 components. Throughout this course, when we get to the graphical portion, you might notice that I'm going to use the letter Y to represent GDP. It's basically just kind of a catch-all letter terminology for national income for economists. So I'm just going to call GDP Y. I might just put GDP, but if you see the letter Y, it just means gross domestic product or some sort of national income measurement. And the sum of these components equals that GDP. So the first component is C, which is consumption, then I, which is investment, then G, which is government spending, and then NX, which stands for net exports. Net exports is actually the combination of 2 things, exports and imports, but net means the difference. Remember, gross means total without subtracting anything. Net means that you've subtracted something away from it. So what you're going to do is you're going to do exports minus imports to calculate net exports. The reason why we subtract imports is because they'll be positive for the foreign country, they'll be negative for our domestic country. Exports will be positive for our country, negative for the foreign country. And so if you basically added up all of the world's net export values, it would equal zero. Just like if you were keeping track of the standings of sports teams and they played and you took the collective record of all the teams, it would be 500 because every game had to have one winner and one loser unless there's ties. And so if every game has a one winner and one loser, well then everybody, and then that means that when you add in everyone's record, it's going to be as many wins as losses. So just like here, there's going to be as many outflows as inflows if you added everyone together. So for the sake of accounting purposes, so if you've taken an accounting class or will take an accounting class, your balance sheet basically needs to be even. Basically, this is the world's balance sheet in terms of trade. That's why you would subtract imports. So that'll be a negative number if you're importing stuff from another country. And then exports will be positive because we're shipping stuff of value to some other country and we're being compensated for it. But anyways, you can break GDP down into these four different components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption is going to be the largest component of GDP. So consumption is basically just spending by households on goods and services, but not including spending on new homes. So new homes are going to count towards GDP because of the fact that there's some sort of productivity happening and there's a value attached to it. So selling homes that already exist, yeah, there's an appreciation in value because of market forces, but not because of productivity. So we're not measuring productivity, we're not measuring value of the market, we're measuring the actual production value. So new homes and any sort of improvement or renovation to an existing home, that will count towards GDP, but it will not count under the component of consumption because not only can households buy houses and build houses, but so can businesses. So rather than group together or have to decide between, okay, was it a private family that built this house or was it a subdivision contractor developer that built these houses, rather than have to differentiate between those two relationships, we just group them together. And that'll be under investment, not consumption. And it kind of makes sense because in a way, a home is an investment. Some people say it isn't, some people say it is. Well, the reality is that unless you're underwater on your mortgage or the house value of your home depreciates substantially, it is in a way an asset or an investment because as you pay the mortgage down, you develop equity in that home. So that's equity that you wouldn't have if you were renting. So consumption is spending by goods and services. Spending by households on goods and services. So there are three subcategories that we can describe these as. We have durable goods, we have non-durable goods, and we have services. Services are the largest component of consumption. You might think durable goods because they're bigger and they last longer, and they're cars and they're furniture and washers and dryers. But the reality is that services dwarf durable goods and non-durable goods in terms of value. Because think about healthcare, education. Healthcare is about 1 out of every $5 of GDP. It comes from the healthcare system. That's all services, or most of it's services. Education, so you being here, that's a service. Car washes, banking services. There's tons of services. Everything's a service. Our economy is mainly based on services these days. And so the highest value of these three subcategories is going to be services. I think it's actually somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of all spending by consumption, meaning spending spending by households on goods and services is in services. Durable goods and non-durable goods, really the difference is how long it will last. So a durable good is a good that is expected to last over an extended period of time. Usually that cutoff line is somewhere between 2 and 3 years. It used to be, when I first took economics a long time ago, durable goods length of time cutoff is 10 years. So basically anything that was expected to last 10 years or longer was considered a durable good. Nowadays, it's hard pressed to find anything that will last longer than 10 years besides a house or, I mean, these days cars last for a really long time, even though we tend to get newer ones at a frequency that's smaller than a 10-year time window. But like even some of the appliances that used to last 30 to 50 years, like 10 years, 15 years. I think about furnaces. Like the furnace in my house is almost 30 years old. And so like because recently like most furnaces have kind of a shelf life of 15 years according to HVAC instructors that I've communicated with. Um, the reality is that getting something that lasts longer than 10 to 15 years seems to be unheard of these days. So they shortened it to 3 years. So it wasn't even just kind of the built-in obsolescence that caused that shift. It was really just because of technology like cell phones and laptops. The time horizon and changing generations of technology is so short now that a durable good may be durable, but it may not be viable based on the software that it's using. So like I've got a graveyard of laptops somewhere in my house of that were perfectly functional when I moved on to the newer laptop. But the reason why I had to move on to the newer laptop was just that the old one was running so slow because of the increase in demands of RAM and space and processing power was such that it really couldn't handle it for the long term. So I had to move on, even though I missed those old ones. In fact, I've got a MacBook that's sitting here on the floor next to me that was my favorite laptop, but unfortunately it broke, and all my other laptops never broke. That was actually the first one that ever did, and so I moved on and got a new laptop. In fact, I actually didn't get a laptop for a few months. I just kind of dealt with not having one for a while, which is kind of crazy because I was in the middle of a PhD program where everyone was using like statistical tools, but for me, I just went to the library and used the computer until I scraped together enough money to buy myself a new laptop, which I'm still using to this day. But so that's durable goods. Non-durable goods are goods that are usually consumed almost immediately or do not last for an extended period of time. So an example of a non-durable good is food. Clothing is considered non-durable. So like for some people, like they have the same clothes for 10, 20, 30 years because either they don't want to buy new stuff or they buy good quality stuff then and they take good care of it so it doesn't kind of fall apart right away. But based on magazines and marketing, like we treat like clothes as in like you have to buy a new set of clothes every season. Like, oh, it's summer, we got to buy new clothes. Oh, it's the fall fashion season, we got to buy new clothes. So because of that, we've treated them as non-durable. And also if you have children, you know how fast they grow out of those. So it almost does feel like every season you need new clothes, not because of fashion, but because they will like hulk out of the clothes if you don't update them fast enough. So consumption is the largest component of GDP. It basically makes up 70%. So a lot of people sometimes think that government spending is the largest component of American GDP. It is tiny in comparison to consumption. Consumption is basically 70 cents out of every dollar, and it may even be more than that. The second component of GDP is investment. So investment, some textbooks call it gross private domestic investment, but the catch-all term is investment. There are three subcategories of investment, which basically encompass the definition of investment. Basically, investment is spending by firms on capital goods, plants. So plants, not like, oh, we're gonna have some like roses and tulips in the like office building, but like the actual production plant, like where the assembly and the production of the product is happening. So when firms invest in capital goods and new facilities, that's known as business fixed investment. So business fixed investment is basically the level of investment that's going to be undertaken in order to be able to grow the business long term. Because if you don't buy new equipment, you don't buy new tools, you don't expand the facility, then you're limiting your potential ability to produce a certain quantity of goods and services, and that won't put you in terms of a good position for long-term viability. The second one is goods that are produced and not yet sold. So I've mentioned this quite a bit. Inventory investment. So inventory. So if you build a car this year and you don't sell it till next year, the value of the cost of the production of the car will count under inventory investment. If you sell that car, then it goes under consumption under durable goods. But the value of it under consumption will be higher than that if it's under investment, because you'll distinctly know how much the market values at it and how much it's contributed to that year's economy if you sell it in that year. But if you sell in the subsequent year, it's not really contributing to your economy anymore because it's something from the previous year that you're trying to offload and sell. Like I said, if you're a business that bought a bunch of inventory or produced a bunch of inventory for something that people don't really want, and it's just sitting in a warehouse or in the back in terms of like some facility, and it's just taking up space, the reality is that you can sell it for a loss, you can liquidate it, but it won't negatively impact the contribution to the GDP in that given year. The floor is the cost of production. The ceiling is however much you end up selling it for that is beyond the cost of production. And so inventory is our way of accounting for stuff that isn't sold yet, but we built. So we want to account for things that people are making, so they can kind of keep the supply chain consistent. So there's some lead time, so they don't end up running out of inventory and then basically having some sort of gap where they can't sell anything because they don't have anything to sell. And then the third category as it pertains to investment is residential investment. So residential investment is spending by households and firms on new homes or making improvements to existing homes. So like renovating, flipping, stuff like that. All of that falls under residential investment. So we don't kind of have to differentiate between, is it a developer? We don't have to differentiate between, is it a single family that's building their own house? We just group them all together so that way the value of them is it is just all there, and we don't have to think about who owns it and who's building it. And again, since like I said before, like you can develop equity by owning a house versus renting, you can treat it from that perspective as an investment as well. So investment is the second largest component of GDP. It's somewhere between like 20 to 25% of GDP. So it's about 20 to 25% of GDP. So like consumption was 70 to 75, investment is 20 to 25. Our third component is government spending. So government spending is spending by federal, state, and local governments. So as mundane as your local town's government and town hall and city hall or board of elections person or treasurer, as big as building a new highway, giant military aircraft carriers. Basically, it could be paper clips in town hall, and it could be I-80. It doesn't really matter the scope. All of it, so long as it's spending by the federal government, the state government, or the local government on goods and services, it is going to count as government spending. Now, one important thing to discuss is something known as transfer payments. This year and the previous year, and maybe even again in the future, and back in 2008, there were checks known as stimulus checks. Stimulus checks are payments from the government to households and people and citizens in the hopes that it will allow for them to have money to live off of or have money to kind of help stimulate consumption in the economy. The same thing holds true for unemployment. So some of you may have been on unemployment in the past, maybe you're currently on unemployment, or maybe you'll be on unemployment in the future. Unemployment is also a transfer payment. It's the same process, but instead of it just being here's a check to everyone because we just need to get money in the hands of people so they spend it, unemployment is pointed towards people who qualify as individuals who are unemployed based on a certain set of circumstances, which we'll talk about when we talk about the unemployment section of the course. Those are examples of what are known as transfer payments. The reason why those payments by the government do not count towards GDP is because there was no production as a result. It may end up counting towards GDP in the form of consumption if the citizen that gets that check spends it on goods and services personally. But from the actual measurement of government spending, if the government spends $1.8 trillion on transfer payments, that $1.8 trillion does not count towards GDP as a form of government spending. It may count as $1.8 trillion in GDP towards consumption, but it's up to the individual person who collects that transfer payment to figure out how they want to spend that. If they're paying debt off, it doesn't count as consumption, it just counts as savings. But if they buy like a new TV or some food or pay their rent, that'll count as consumption. So it will eventually potentially have some impact on GDP, but not through government spending, through consumption. So again, transfer payments are payments by the government to households for which the government does not receive a new good or service in return. Social Security is one, disability is one as well. Basically, if you're not providing them with a job or service in exchange for the money, then it doesn't count towards GDP. Now, if you work for Lockheed Martin and they give you a contract to build a new fighter jet, then sure, that counts towards GDP because the government bought a fighter jet. If the government commissions a 30-mile stretch of Interstate 80 to be repaved through federal dollars, then yes, that's a project that counts towards GDP because there was some sort of production that was generated as a result of the contract for doing that section of the interstate. So that's government spending. The last one is net exports. So again, net exports is the difference between exports and imports. Exports are goods and services that are produced in the domestic country and sold abroad. So that means that if something was produced in the United States and we sell it to Canada, or something was produced in the United States and we sell it to Germany, or something was produced in the United States and sold to China, that money that those foreigners spent to buy the product that was made in America will come back towards America, and that will count positively towards our GDP because it's counting the value of the thing that was produced in our country's borders. Just because it was bought by someone else outside of our borders does not matter. The value and the circulation of income and value from it is coming from production within the borders of the nation, and therefore it counts as an export. On the other hand, and so exports count positively towards GDP. On the other hand, if the money that is spent by foreigners on our stuff counts positively towards our GDP, it should make sense that imports, things that we buy from other countries for their production within their own countries, will count as an import, and that will count negatively towards our GDP. We'll actually subtract the money we spend on foreign goods out of our own GDP bottom line. So, imports are goods and services that are produced abroad but purchased by, or excuse me, produced abroad but purchased by the domestic country. So if Canada makes something and we buy it as Americans, it's an import for America, it's an export for Canada. So it counts positively towards our GDP, or excuse me, towards Canada's GDP. It counts negatively towards the US's GDP. So do you think that the US is a net importer or a net exporter? We are by a huge margin a net importer. So here's an image that comes from the Federal Reserve Economic Database. So FRED is the Federal Reserve Economic Database. We will utilize this service throughout the course through assignments, projects, or just kind of lectures that I pinpoint certain data points from this data source. The top graph indicates the change in real gross domestic product. So we'll get to talking about what real means in the future, in the short future. Basically, we need to convert our variable of GDP into a variable that adjusts for inflation. Because again, if the value of the dollar changes or prices change, then we want to make sure that the production that is improving from actually making more stuff, not just from charging higher prices for it, aka pure inflation. So for us to measure the change in GDP over time, we use a real variable, and that is indicated by the top graph. If you see those gray bars in the graphs, those gray bars represent recessions. So those gray bars indicate when we had economic downturns, which you can see, notice that basically little blips downward correlate and correspond with those gray bars. And then the kind of the white backgrounded areas indicate the economic expansion phases. So notice that real GDP has continuously grown substantially over the past, let's see here, how far back does that go? It goes back to 1943 or 47, so 70 to 80 years. On the other hand, the bottom graph shows you what the net exports is. So what is exports minus imports equal for the United States? Now, up until the mid 70s, maybe even the early 80s, we had a pretty balanced trade balance. So basically, if you look at it, we kind of trended along zero for a good 40 to 50 years. In the 80s, there's a couple of reasons why you see this change. One is because of globalization starting to emerge. The second one is because our wealth started to surge. So if you look at the relationship between our trade balance plummeting here in the negative and our GDP kind of increasing substantially, notice how it was growing incrementally, and then between 80 and 2010 it just kind of skyrockets. Subsequently, our trade balance falls substantially as well. So some people are worried about the fact that we are net importers and that we have basically at our peak in around 2006, 2007, we were importing $800 billion more of foreign goods than we were selling of our own goods to foreign countries. And so people were upset over the fact that, hey, like, if we're importing, like, if we just made that stuff here, then we would have more economic productivity, we'd have more jobs, and GDP would be higher. But again, a lot of this parallels with the concept of comparative advantage. You're noticing that we are becoming a huge net importer at the same time we are getting much, much wealthier in terms of an economy. And the reason why this is happening is twofold. The first one is that we're specializing in the things that create us the highest level of wealth, which allows for us to basically lean into the things that are going to get us the most money and wealth domestically, and leave the lower value generating, lower income generating products and positions and jobs to other countries. So you're seeing that rise in wealth because of the fact that we aren't having to spread ourselves so thin to take care of everything for ourselves. We can now lean on other countries for lower cost and lower sailed items and focus on the things that create more wealth for our own country. The other thing that has to do with that is it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. Because we're becoming more wealthy, we have the means to buy more stuff. And so we don't really care where the stuff comes from. We just want it. And if it turns out that it's something that's cheap, well, we've delegated that to the foreign country so we can focus on the things that create us more wealth. And so maybe we import stuff from foreign countries because we still want the cheap stuff, but it's no longer made here. It's made overseas. And now that we have more money because we've leaned into the process of producing and creating things that create more wealth in our own country instead of having to spread ourselves too thin, we now can afford to buy those things from other countries and more of it. So just because we're a net importer does not necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It's more indicative of the fact that we are a wealthy country so we can afford stuff. And secondly, it also indicates that we've specialized and leaned into the things that create more wealth than the things that don't. Again, that doesn't mean that it's perfect and it's a perfect solution. It's going to destroy certain industries and cause people to lose their jobs. And if they haven't acquired additional skills to pivot to a different career because they've been doing the same thing for so long, then you have negative impacts. And when we talk about unemployment later on, we'll talk about kind of what that means and what the implications of that are. So I'm not here to say, oh, well, just because we globalized and just because of all this, that everything's perfect and the economy's perfect and you should feel bad if you aren't feeling the same way that the economy shows. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I'm saying quite the opposite. I'm just saying that from a utilitarian perspective, the macroeconomy might be doing better, but certain pockets of the population are going to get hit disproportionately hard because of that adaptation of the economy. So let's do a quick little example here. Basically, I just wanted to identify which component these things fall under so you know kind of what is what. So if we're building new homes for families, the contribution to GDP will happen because, let's see here, it's a final good. The final good is the home. It's being produced in the country, and it's in the same year in which this is being produced. And so the value of that is 100 million. It fits all of the requirements of the definition, so it will count towards GDP. And the component, remember, is not consumption. Even though it's for families, all residential investment falls under investment. The second category speaks to asparagus. We are getting asparagus from China, and we're getting $10 million worth of asparagus from China. If we in the United States are buying asparagus from China, that's an import. So will that count towards GDP? The answer is yes, but it's not going to be positive. It's going to be a negative value. It's going to be negative contribution to GDP because it's an import. Now, what about wheat? If we produce wheat in Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa and we ship it off to Canada because they really like bread up there and they really like wheat just like we like wheat, and Canada or Canadians buy $8 million worth of American wheat, is that going to count towards GDP? Of course it is, because it's a final good. It's produced in our country, and it's going to be sold within the same year, or it's going to be produced in the year in which we're measuring. And so that's going to count positively towards GDP in the form of an export. Aircraft carriers for the Navy. Okay, so the aircraft carrier is a final good for the government, spent by the government, produced in the year, and it's produced in America. So yes, that's going to count towards GDP, and it's going to count under government spending. Ice cream, just good old-fashioned big old tubs of ice cream. In fact, so much ice cream that it's $50 million worth of ice cream. That's a lot of ice cream. Well, ice cream to me seems like a final good. I'm buying it, I'm eating it. And it was produced in the country. We're assuming that it's good old fashioned, made from milk from cows in Wisconsin or something like that, and turned into ice cream. Whether it's the old fashioned way with the salts or churned or whatever way method, are you getting it from your local dairy place? Doesn't matter. It's all domestic ice cream. It's counting in GDP and it counts under consumption because that's spending by households on ice cream, delicious ice cream. The last one is cups for Dairy Queen blizzards. So Dairy Queen has a flurry. It's called a blizzard. Most of you are probably familiar with it, but if you're not familiar with it, it's basically soft serve ice cream with candy pieces mixed in. They have a weird worry metal thing that they shove into your ice cream that hopefully is sanitized, and it makes a really loud, obnoxious, piercing noise. And then once it's done whirring, it's hopefully mixed in if they did it properly. And then you get a long red spoon and maybe they put a lid on it and then they flip it upside down to show you that the ice cream hasn't melted. And then you eat it and then you're happy, hopefully. But right now we're just talking about the cup. The cup is going to be a component of that finished product because it's going to be cup plus soft serve ice cream plus red spoon plus candy pieces plus maybe a lid equals the final finished product of the blizzard. The value of the $20 million in cups that Dairy Queen spends is going to be factored into the final value of the blizzards in which they sell. So the cup here is actually not going to count towards GDP. It's an intermediate good. So it will not count towards GDP. So if we want to figure out what the final contributions component by component and the sum of the GDP based on this example is, you're going to add the investment, add exports, add government spending, add consumption, subtract imports, and ignore the intermediate goods. And when you do that, you end up with a value of $448 million. So you get 100 minus 10 plus 8 plus 300 plus 50. Sorry, not 500, 50 plus 0. And when you do that, you get 100 million for investment, you get 50 million for consumption, you get 300 million for government spending, and then you get positive 8 minus 10 million, which is equal to negative 2 million for net exports. And so the sum of that is $448 million. Another way in which we can assess GDP is known as the value added method. So hopefully this kind of helps put into context like the car example. This is an example of LL Bean selling a t-shirt. In order to make a t-shirt, you need some fabric. In order to get the fabric, you need some cotton. And in order to get the cotton, you need a cotton farmer. So a cotton farmer farms cotton. He basically sells the next person in the supply chain that cotton for $1. So the cotton farmer sells the raw cotton to the textile farmer for $1. Basically, they went from cultivating land and growing cotton, so it had a value of nothing, and then that cotton has a value of $1. So you end up with creation of $1 in value. The textile mill takes that cotton, turns it into a fabric. They then sell that fabric to the t-shirt company for $3. So if you take the $3 that was the value of the fabric and you subtract the $1 from the cotton value, you create $2 in additional value. If The t-shirt company takes their cotton fabric and sews it up into a t-shirt, and they sell that t-shirt to LL Bean at wholesale for $15. Well, then the $15 for the shirt minus the $3 that was paid for the fabric creates $12 in additional value by turning it from fabric into a shirt. And then last but not least, LL Bean buys the shirt for $15, screen prints LL Bean in the top left or right corner of the shirt, and then sells it on their website for $35. And they sell it for $35. Well, by virtue of the trademark being put on their shirt and sold on their website, they end up creating an additional $20 in value from that cotton. So if you're confused by why we don't include intermediate goods, it's for this reason. That basically, if we counted intermediate goods, then we would be adding in stuff that's already factored into the value of the shirt. Because if we were to basically not do this value added method and include intermediate goods, then we would overstate that the contribution to GDP of this t-shirt is $54, because we'd be like, it's 35 plus 15 plus 3 plus 1, it's $54. But the reality is that the contribution to the economy is $35, because the value of the cotton, the value of the fabric, and the value of the shirt is factored into the final price of the shirt that's sold by LL Bean. Because if you add in the value addeds along the way, 1 plus 2 plus 12 plus 20, that's the same value that you got from the actual product, the sale of the shirt. Now, if you end up not selling the product, then basically the cost of production would be equivalent to the contribution to GDP. So that would be $15 plus however much it would have cost them to screen print the logo on. So if it's free, then we would say it's $15 would be the contribution to inventories. If it's like $1 to do that, then it's $16 would be the contribution to inventories. So that's the difference. If you sell it, then you know what the distinct value added is. If you don't sell it, then you just add up the value added up until that final point, which is basically just the sum of the cost of production. So that's the value added method to show you kind of why intermediate goods don't count in GDP, because you don't want to double count and overinflate the value. So just to recap everything that we learned, I think this slide is really critical in terms of understanding all of the elements that go into GDP. So that way, like when you're doing homework assignments where I gave you a scenario, this is a really good starting point. There's a couple other things that we have to talk about that also might play a role, but I'll get to those shortly. But just to recap, remember this definition is critical. There's 4 components: total value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a period of time. So the total value is basically the sum of all of the dollar values of the goods and services. Final goods and services are goods and services that are purchased by final users, meaning that intermediate goods do not count towards GDP. The value of the intermediate good will be factored into the final price of the product, or it will be factored into the total cost of the product if it is factored into GDP in the form of inventories. Goods that are produced and not yet sold, again, fall under that inventory category. And then new homes, even though some of them might be built by individual households, which you might think is consumption, so we don't have to chase down to who and why people are building the house. We just group all new home production as residential investment, whether it's done by a private person or a private family or by a developer. Transfer payments do not count towards GDP. So if I say what's the contribution to GDP when the government sends out $1 million in stimulus checks? Well, the answer to GDP contribution is 0 from the actual checks themselves. Now, if someone takes the checks and spends money out of them, then the money that they spent that counts towards consumption will count towards GDP, but we have no way of actually determining that with the measurement techniques that we have. And then last but not least, net exports. Remember that exports count positively towards GDP and imports count negatively. One of the biggest mistakes that I see when people are factoring in and calculating net exports is they falsely ignore imports and they count them as zero when they actually should be negative. So please do not make that mistake. Now, I mentioned one of these things before. We have a couple of shortcomings with GDP, just like with wins above replacement baseball, like I mentioned before. There's a bunch of shortcomings when it comes to GDP. The first one is that it doesn't account for household production. So if you make dinner for family and friends, if you give someone a ride to work, if you volunteer, there's an economic value to that. To you, there's definitely utility that you derive from it where you can actually personally quantify the value of it. But there's actual economic value for all those things if you were to commercialize it. So if you Ubered someone to work and were paid $17 for it, well, then that counts towards GDP. But if you give a friend a ride to work and they don't pay you and it's just a favor, well, it counts as zero in terms of market value, even though if it would have just been an Uber, it would have been $17 towards GDP. So if you go to a restaurant and you buy a meal, but you make the same meal at home for yourself and you don't pay yourself for it, well, then that doesn't count towards GDP. But if you go to the restaurant, it does. So really, household production, we kind of see it as savings. So when you do things for yourself and you don't hire someone else to do it, the reason why you do it is you're like, I'm saving money by doing that. But the reality is that to you, the value is the money saved, which is basically saying that instead of spending $2,000 to have someone paint my house, I did it myself, so I saved $2,000. So technically, there's a value there of $2,000, but because the government has no way of paper trailing every little thing that you do for yourself, we can't really factor that into GDP as a value in some way, shape, or form. So household production is valuable in economics. Instead of it being value that we've created in terms of wealth, it's value that we've created in terms of savings so we don't lose wealth. So we're protecting our wealth by doing things for ourselves. So there is an economic value, but because the government can't see that economic value and there's really no objective way of identifying it, we don't count it in GDP. The other category in terms of underestimating the total contributions and production that's going on in an economy is the underground economy. So the underground economy is production and transaction of goods and services that are concealed from the government. One of two reasons. One, it's illegal. Two, you just don't want to pay taxes on it. So if you work for a restaurant and you're a server or you're a delivery person or you work in any other profession, cosmetology or estheticians or any other type of tip-based business, and you get tips in cash, a lot of times you won't report the cash tips, but you report the credit tips because you have to. But if it's done with cash, oftentimes people will not report them. Why? Because then you'd have to pay taxes on it. So what ends up happening is that you underreport your actual contribution so you don't have to pay taxes on it, and it allows for your take-home pay to be higher than it otherwise would be if you were straight up being paid $14, $15 an hour. So some people say like, hey, I don't mind making the lower wage because then I pay lower taxes. But the reality is that I don't know if $2 an hour is really sustainable for anybody. And it's kind of scary to have your income dependent upon how people like you, whether fair or unfair in terms of judgment. So I delivered pizzas for a long time, cash tips. I'll say on record that I reported them, but I do know other delivery drivers who did not report their cash tips. And so they ended up saving that tax money that they didn't have to pay it on it because they concealed it from the government. But it can be illicit things too. It can be drugs or human trafficking or illegal things, deep web things, counterfeit stuff. It can be a bunch of different insidious things that are protected from the government, or things that maybe public thinks should be legal but isn't, or things like that. But because they aren't legal, people go to the underground economy to find that product that they're looking for. If everything that was in the underground economy was legal, I'm not saying it should be. In fact, most of the things that are in the underground economy should stay illegal. But if we were to hypothetically make the entire underground economy legal, it would be equivalent to about 10% of our actual regular above board reported GDP. So basically, lots of economies have a underground economy that basically understates the true size of an economy because of legal issues or taxation issues. Um, and so the reality is that, like, if the underground economy of the United States or the underground economy of India was an actual economy in and of itself, it would probably be top 5 or top 10 in GDP alone. So just like California by itself would be like the world's, like, I think 7th largest economy. Well, California has basically about 10 to 11% of the US population. So if California's economy is the 7th largest in the world, then the underground economy of the United States would also be the 7th largest in the world, tied with California. So a lot of the underground economy, when I say underground economy, that's why I don't like using other terms. Some people call it the shadow economy. Some people call it the black market. I don't think that, like, I know some people think black market is pejorative, or shadow economy is kind of like shady or something like that, or underground economy is bad. Like, not everything that is being concealed from the government, like from the government's perspective, it's illegal if you're evading taxes. But the reality is a lot of it is just kind of for convenience's sake. Like, if you make like $15 on a lottery ticket, like, you probably aren't going to report that on your tax return, because like it's $15, and like the government's more interested in the big marginal changes in your income. If you win like 100,000, yeah, you'll report that, or else you get in big trouble with the government. But if it's like a $20 scratch off, they're probably not going to care. And there's probably also laws in the books that kind of create a threshold in which you need to report it. Like, I think it's like $2,000 in some states, where if you don't make anything more than that, then you don't need to report it for tax purposes. And it's for those convenience things. Like, if you're under 16 and you're working from home and you're doing things for family members or neighbors, like mowing their grass or whatever, like, they're probably not going to issue you a W-2 because they don't have an employer tax ID. So sometimes those things don't get reported. So when you see underground economy, you don't automatically have to think the worst. It can be as mundane as just, oh, I got $10. Oops, I didn't report it on my tax return, versus something quite serious and quite illegal and quite insidious. So, and then the range of that varies based on state to state and country to country. A lot of people ask, like, how does marijuana play a role in the GDP measurements? Because I think, what is it? As of right now, I think it's like 11 or 12 states, it's legal, recreationally legal. I think in 38 states, maybe even more than that, it's medically legal. And so some people, but it's federally illegal. So it's like, okay, so if you're reporting the GDP of the United States, yet like there's legitimate businesses in cannabis around the entire nation, like, and there are states collecting substantial tax revenues from it, like, how do you report that? So I believe right now, because it is federally illegal, they can't report cannabis revenues at the federal level, but you can be sure that if it was like Massachusetts or Oregon or Washington or Colorado's like GDP measurements or their like tax revenue reports, clearly they're going to include that because it's a pretty significant business entity within their state borders. In fact, in 2018 or 2019, Oregonians, I think, got like $25 to $100 in tax rebates because they collected so much tax revenue in marijuana and cannabis sales that was beyond what they needed for the budget and the rainy day fund. So clearly, as it becomes more legal, then those little like arbitrage situations and kind of unique situations where they're like the only person doing it will kind of diminish that market. And also, when I was living out there, there was so many businesses trying to get into that space and operating that basically, if I went back next year, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those dispensaries went under just because the prices were pushed down because there was such a high supply of it. But that's the underground economy, and it doesn't count in GDP. The last thing I want to talk about is shortcomings for GDP as a measurement of well-being. Just like I told you, we can't necessarily take the value of a baseball player just based on some weird statistic metric. Just like we don't judge books by their covers, just like we don't necessarily have a good depiction of an individual as good or bad or friendly or rude or whatever, just based on a first impression, even though we oftentimes fall victim to doing that. GDP is not a catch-all term for economic activity. So like from a macro perspective, from the US's perspective, it's a good benchmark and it's a good starting point, but I'm not going to sit here and act like it's perfect because it isn't. And I don't think the textbook acts like it's perfect. And I don't think anyone really acts like it's perfect. I think it's just there as kind of an efficient way to kind of measure and benchmark where we are with a simple number rather than just like being like, well, it's complicated, because a lot of people are not interested in nuanced arguments at the moment. So, but if you are interested in nuance and you are interested in trying to determine whether or not one economy is good or a country is in good shape or an area of the country or wherever you're interested in moving to is healthy, safe, and abundant and prosperous for what you need it to be, then clearly GDP is not the only thing that you should be looking at. You should be looking at not only the wealth and the economic activity, but you might want to look at the value of leisure. So maybe the reason why there's high cost of living in beautiful places is because you're in close proximity to things that are of luxurious leisure. So if you're close to the mountains or close to a forest, you pay more money. You're close to the ocean, you pay more money. You're close to water of any sort that's not completely contaminated, then you pay more money, because people like looking at water, looking at trees, looking at mountains, and hiking through forest and hunting in forest and swimming in water and climbing those mountains. So naturally, the value of leisure is not measured in GDP. GDP does not adjust for pollution or negative externalities. A negative externality is a cost that is borne by society that should have been borne by the person that's producing the good or service, but because no one holds them accountable, we're left footing the bill. So like pollution and contamination of water sources and other sources that are important to our health and kind of the ecosystem. GDP doesn't care about that. Like you can pollute to oblivion, but as long as it's yielding high production, GDP doesn't really care about that. So like if you're mining coal and pulling oil out, or you're producing stuff in a paper mill and you're dumping stuff into the water and you're dumping stuff into the sky, or you're fracking and causing earthquakes, like if that's creating economic activity, it's only going to reflect the economic activity as a result. So a lot of the environmental economics movement environmental economics has been around for a long time, but part of the reason why environmental economics existed was it was about extraction. It was like, what is the market value of cutting this tree down, pulling these fish out of this aquifer, pulling this water out of this aquifer, pulling these fish out of this stream or this ocean or this lake, extracting this coal out of the earth, this gold out of the earth, this oil out of the earth, this natural gas out of the earth, all of this stuff out of the earth. And we don't really care about the long-term consequences to our health and well-being. We just care about how much we can sell it for. So if we clear cut this land and we put a subdivision on it, that's worth more than just getting to look at it and breathe the oxygen that's being generated by it being a carbon sink for us. It doesn't adjust for crime and social problems. So yeah, like you can live in the most prosperous city in the world or the most prosperous area, but if it's riddled with crime or social problems or corruption or income inequality and all these other things, then it might not be really conducive to you as an individual to live there or feel like you're in a good situation. It's not adjusted for the physical health of citizens. So we could double our GDP real easy. We can double our GDP by just working twice as much as we do now. So if we worked 80 hours a week instead of 40 hours a week, well, we can produce $40 trillion worth of stuff. But the reality is again, the value of leisure and the physical health of our citizens aren't factored into GDP there. So yeah, we could work more, but we might live shorter periods of time. We have less leisure. So are we really happy? And so is it really worth it to have all that wealth if you're never going to be able to enjoy it the way you want to? It's the reason why I'm in the profession that I'm in. I could plausibly make more money in a different profession, but I value free time to the point while I'm still young and agile and capable of doing things, to instead of making an extra, I don't know, $30,000 to $40,000 a year or $10,000 a year, to work during the summer all day, every day, like I would any other day of the week or every other week out of the year, just so I can retire 3 to 7 years early. I can instead work those same 3 to 7 years, but 3 months out of every year between the time I'm in my late 20s or early 20s when I started this profession to my 30s to where I'm at in the profession now to my 50s and 60s, I'm going to have 7 years of free time while I'm young and healthy to do the things that I want to do versus just kind of working during that time and then being able to do the things I want to do when I'm 55, 60, 65, where I'm hopefully will still be healthy and still agile enough to do the things that I'm doing now. But there's a high risk that I might not be able to 25 to 30 years from now. So why not enjoy it while I'm young and old instead of just enjoying it when I'm older and possibly not able to because I either died too soon or I got a health problem as a result. And then lastly, GDP does not adjust for the distribution of wealth. So again, income inequality is a big issue. Okay, so like, why is it that even though my wage goes up, my purchasing power goes down? Or why is it that even though I'm making a decent salary, I'm working 40, 60 hours a week, I can barely pay my rent, or I can't afford to buy a house in town because home prices are too high? Those things are all legitimate questions that you should ask about where you live as a member of that society, where you want to move to, what country you're living in, to get a more holistic perspective of whether that country is in good shape or not, or whether that city, that state, that community is in good shape or not, rather than just looking at how much wealth they create, because that's not necessarily everything. The other variable that we have is gross national product. Again, as I mentioned before, gross national income or gross national product is basically the total value of final goods and services that is produced by citizens in a country. So gross national product basically is the total value of all final goods and services produced by citizens of a country. So this one, remember where I talked about Ford making a car in Mexico or Toyota making a car in America? that would, in GNP's perspective, the car being made in Mexico would count towards America's GDP, and the car being made and the Toyota being made in Tennessee would count towards Japan's GDP. So this does a good job of measuring the value of multinational corporations and their sphere of influence across the world. So like how is America's fingerprints all over the world size up based on their foreign direct investment? So foreign direct investment is citizens of other countries investing in other countries. From foreign nationals, from multinational corporations, so like Nike, and conglomerates like Nestle, which is blah, and Unilever, and all these other companies that basically kind of conglomerize and buy up a bunch of businesses and have kind of arms all over the world. It's a good way of measuring kind of the sphere of influence of like one country across the world. But if you're trying to measure the actual value of the economy domestically to see how things stateside are, GDP is the better estimate. The reason why GNP can be problematic is, let's say that 90% of all of the economy production is for an American company in Tuvalu. That would mean that basically GNP would only reflect 10% of Tuvalu's economy, and that 90% of Tuvalu's economy would count towards America's GNP. So that's the reason why we don't necessarily use GNP, but rather we use GDP as our measurement of national income. But this one does exist. With that being said, that concludes this section of our discussion on gross domestic product. Our next lecture will discuss real GDP. So why do we have to convert GDP to a different variable? The reason why is because the value of things and the prices of things change consistently over time due to inflation. So we want to be able to accurately estimate the changes in the size of the economy based on how much more we're making, not just how much more we're charging. And so that will be where we pick up on next lecture. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask or communicate with me on that. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day and best of luck on your assessments.
Thank you.